Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn Knight with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today in Birding Basics we are covering one of my favorite families in the bird world, Cathartidae. Now Cathartidae are our New World vultures, and unlike some of the previous families that we've talked about, this is a relatively small one. With only 7 extant species throughout the world. And when I say throughout the world, I really do mean just the Americas, North and South. They're called the New World vultures for a reason. We're not going off into Europe or Asia or Africa with these guys. We're strictly in the Western Hemisphere. So, with that, and the fact that we only really have 3 of these guys showing up in the States, rather than having to cherry pick between species that are found, once again, throughout the world to find a good example that we can take a look at for this family as a whole, today we actually get an opportunity to look at the 3 species that we get in the States in far greater detail. So, starting us off, we're going to start with the smallest of these birds, and that is our black vulture. So these are large black birds with a grayish-black head. You're going to notice that head looks significantly smaller than the rest of its body. We're going to be talking about that and why that is a feature of these vultures in a little while. But that coloration is important for identification purposes. Now, these guys, I say, are the smallest. Their wingspan is still around 5 feet, so easily this size of a 4th grader. So you think about that, and it's like that's the small example for this. These are large birds, and that is one of the field marks to keep in mind for that. Now, these birds are ranging mostly in the southern states, but they do go up the east coast a ways into the northeast. We get them here in California as casual visitors, which is to say it's not totally unexpected that we might see 1 or 2 as the season goes by, but it's still worth getting out there to check off your list and actually get to see if it comes up on your bird alert. Our next species in this family, going up a little bit larger, is our turkey vulture. Now, these guys are our most common vultures. They've got the widest range of this family here in North America. They are found on both coasts, in fact, across the U.S. in the summertime, although they do draw back from the Great Plains in the wintertime. It just gets too cold for these guys. For turkey vultures, you're looking at that bright red head that did earn them their name. You may probably see a pretty good resemblance between them and the wild turkeys we were talking about last week. They are not related very closely at all, though. They are, in fact, vultures rather than turkeys themselves. And these guys have about a 6-foot wingspan. So if you're imagining this bird and the size, that should be the distance you're putting between you and the next person right now. They're, as I said, common in North America. If you see a large dark bird that's just kind of circling up in the air in the hills around the Bay Area, odds are pretty good it's a turkey vulture. Now, the 3rd species I want to talk about has a far, far smaller range, a couple of scattered populations in California and in Arizona, and in fact, they're pretty much just found in protected national parks because they are quite endangered, and this is the California condor. Now, this is definitely the largest bird in this family that we get here in North America. The Andean condor, found in South America, is a little bit bigger, but it's also, one of the largest birds in North America, period. These dudes have a 10-foot wingspan, so while size isn't always the best field mark to rely on, with these guys, it's pretty dang reliable. They've got a pink head as opposed to the grayish black and the bright red. It's really hard to mistake a condor for anything else, just because they are absolutely gigantic. These birds experienced a complete population crash due to the use of pesticides and rodenticides and lead poisoning. Our vultures are scavengers, they're carrion eaters. Whatever killed the animals they're eating, it has a very high chance of also getting into their systems, which causes a lot of problems with things like secondary poisonings, which is an issue for all of the species in this family, and in fact vultures throughout the world. So, the range of these birds is important to pay attention to because they do overlap. This is mostly an issue between the black vulture and the turkey vulture. Here's a picture of two of them. This was taken in Florida, where they do, in fact, have overlapping ranges. And while there's about a foot difference in their wingspan, it's important to note that these birds soar really high up in the sky. More often than not, you're not actually going to see them perching or roosting like they're doing here, but rather you'll see them flying way up, couple hundred feet up in the air, just coasting on thermals. Now, while the difference between a 5-foot wingspan and a 6-foot wingspan sounds like a lot in your head, when they're that far away, that high up in the sky, that difference is negligible. So we do need a better way of telling them apart. And so while head color is pretty reliable, as I said, you're not going to see them perching and sitting still very often. They're going to be up in the air because they're looking for food. So, while we've got the head color that is distinct between each of these three species, don't rely on that. For one, color doesn't travel super well with that distance. You're going to have a better chance with light and dark. And for another, once again, vultures' heads look tiny compared to their bodies. That's a very small point of color that you'd be trying to look for. So we go back to that light versus dark, black versus white, that is a lot more easy, or is a lot easier for our eyes to pick out when we're looking at something small, really, really far away. And with that, that brings us to the wings of these birds. And this is actually super handy. So these birds soar. They're going to have their wings stretched out. You're not going to see a lot of flapping wings with these birds, which means we can see the undersides of them really, really well. Now, with something like hawks, a lot of their identifying characteristics on their wings are on the top side. And you hardly ever get to see a hawk from the top side of the wing, so that's not super helpful. With our turkey vultures, that identifying characteristic is actually on the bottom, which is really helpful because we're always looking up and seeing these birds. So on the top, we have our turkey vulture, our most common of the Cathartidae family here in California, and in fact, pretty much throughout the US. And I want you to note that while the leading edge, the edge of the wing that's going into the wind as it flies forward, is dark, it's almost black, the trailing edge, made up of the primaries and the secondaries, those flight feathers, asymmetrical, stiff, large feathers which allow the bird to get the lift necessary to, break the hold of gravity and actually fly, are kind of a silvery gray. It's a far, far paler, and it's a really clear contrast. And that extends all throughout the bottom side of those flight feathers. Now, if we look at the turkey vulture, which is in the bottom corner over here, we're seeing that lighter coloration again, but it's only in the primaries, those feathers that are sticking out and they look kind of like fingers for us. Now, this coloration doesn't extend through the secondaries, it doesn't extend through the tertiary flight feathers. So, it's a far smaller patch of light coloration. And you get a little bit more of that's a smaller wingspan too. But where that pale coloration sits on the wing is super, super important, and it's going to be one of your handiest field marks for telling these birds apart, particularly in overlapping ranges. Also, taking a look at our California condor here, Now this bird, once again, size matters when it's this large of a bird. Odds are pretty good you're not going to mistake it for anything else. But do notice that rather than having that lighter coloration on its flight feathers, it's actually on the coverts. So the leading edge and the trailing edge of the wing is black. That's really stark and easy to see. But they've got white coverts on the inside there that stands out really, really well. The trailing edge, the leading edge, those are dark, but you've got this white stripe going through here. It's also worth noting, you can probably make out in this picture, the condor's actually got tags on its wings. It's right around here. That's just punched through the skin. It's kind of like an earring, essentially. That is for identification purposes. The majority of our condors are actually bred in captivity and then released into the wild. So the majority of them do actually have these numbered tags. It's kind of a running joke. How do you tell what a condor is? Well, you just read off the number on it. These are colored tags, and the reason that they're on the wings is because, well, with many birds, we can band them on their legs, and it has basically a serial number that identifies that bird as its own individual, and we can track them that way throughout their life history. Condors, you're going to be spotting them up in the air with their wings spread. Their legs are going to be as tucked away as they can possibly get them to reduce drag. It's a lot easier to just put that identifying marker on that gigantic wing that's just sticking out there for everybody to see. Back to the captive breeding of our California condors, because it is important. If you ever get a chance, do check out the puppets that are used to feed these guys in captivity. They use hand puppets, which are, not adorable, but they do look more like the parents, and for those purposes, they don't want these birds to imprint on people. They want them to be as wild as possible when they're released into the wild to hopefully breed and survive on their own. So, hand puppets. They're like really, really terrifying Muppets, a la the Dark Crystal, to be honest. So, now that we've got some tools for telling these birds apart, what's going to be some defining characteristics that we can use to define this family? Well, the first thing is that they're carrion eaters. They are scavengers. Now, I was gonna put in pictures of what these birds are eating, but we've all seen roadkill, and frankly, I didn't want to have to tag this video with gore warnings. So if you'd like to see vultures eating their meals, that's a fun Google search that you can do without scarring anybody else. But this is a really important role, and it's one of the reasons that you should really care about our vultures and their health and their numbers in our ecosystems. Vultures basically are the garbage crew of the natural world. They're going to be eating the leftovers of hunts from animals like our coyotes and other predators. They're going to be cleaning up that roadkill that was by the side of the road for a couple weeks. And by doing so, they're not just cleaning away the remains of those animals, they're also reducing the opportunities of harmful bacteria and diseases from basically exploding from an overwhelming mass of just dead animals hanging out. They've got ridiculously strong stomach acid in order to do this. Their gut biome is absolutely fascinating, and they can eat some really disgusting stuff because of that. And, once again, I did mention these birds are susceptible to secondary poisonings for this exact reason. They're willing to eat something that's been dead and just hanging out there for a while, regardless of what killed it necessarily. So if an animal like a ground squirrel dies of rodenticide poisoning, while an animal like a coyote or a bobcat might steer clear of it if it's already dead. A turkey vulture sees that as lunch. So it's always good to keep that in mind if you're considering something like rodenticide. The impacts can go far beyond your intended targets. Now, size is also another factor for these ones. When the smallest of the species that we're talking about in North America has a 5-foot wingspan, size is a factor for these guys. Now, this is a sign of 3 species, the smallest of which is the red-tailed hawk. The one in white is an eagle. And then the very largest one, that's our California condor, that 10-foot wingspan. Now, wingspan is actually a measurement that's occasionally used for people too, with regards to sports like basketball, competitive rock climbing. Essentially, it's the distance you've got between fingertip to fingertip. Same thing holds true for birds. It's feather tip to feather tip, including the length of the body. Now, for humans, the general rule is that's going to be equal to your height, give or take a couple of inches. For most people, it's pretty much exactly their height. Now, just for some sense of scale, because 10 feet is kind of hard for us to imagine, the average basketball player in the NBA is 6'7". That comes out to around 200 centimeters. The average wingspan for a California condor is 277 centimeters, around 10 feet. So you add almost an extra meter of distance in that. What that means is when you're seeing them out, you've basically got something larger than Shaq just floating on the air currents, looking for a deer that's been dead for a couple of days so they can eat it. Now, another defining characteristic of these vultures is that bald head that we get to see so well with things like our turkey vulture, which is bright red, so it stands out really well. Now, the common idea as to why our vultures have bald heads is for hygiene purposes. Birds don't have super flexible bodies, but their necks are incredibly flexible, so they can groom pretty much all of the feathers on their bodies, with the exception of the ones on their head, really, really well. Clean feathers means a healthier bird. It's able to keep warm better. Clean feathers are really important for flight. And vultures are sticking their heads in really gross places, right? That would make sense. But they're not the only feathered scavengers that are willing to just shove their head in roadkill. Plenty of crows are doing it. There's a ton of seabirds that are willing to do that too. So that can't really be our defining reason for why these birds have bald heads. And it isn't. These birds have a number of behaviors that they'll do for thermoregulation. Basically how they keep themselves cool or how they keep themselves warm. This bald head and neck that we see with our Cathartidae family has more to do with thermoregulation. They can draw their head back into their shoulders. If it's cold out, give themselves a little bit more coverage, or they can alternatively stretch it out if it's a really hot day. Now, vultures are a really popular species for when I'm talking to students, and a large part of that has to do with they are just a fountain of gross facts. Not going to blame the kids for that at all. It's pretty awesome. One of the things that they are known for doing in the pursuit of thermoregulation is they will defecate on their legs and then allow the heat of their body to leave via evaporation. It's gross, but you've got to keep cool somehow, and that's one of the ways they do that. Now, the scavenging strategies of these birds does mean that they don't require the really sharp talons, the strong feet, the really strong, curved, sharp bills that we see in our raptors. They've kind of got them. Certainly they're going to be using their beaks to tear apart prey, but they're eating carrion rather than catching something like a rabbit and having to kill it themselves. That means that some of the processing has already occurred for that animal that they're trying to eat. So that doesn't require them to have a really sharp, strong hooked beak that they can tear into healthy living flesh with. It doesn't mean that they need feet that are strong enough that they can actually effectively hunt with them. They just kind of need to be able to land on the ground with them. I do want to talk about the flight for these birds. We mentioned it with Odontophoridae and Phasianidae, birds with short burst flight. They had short rounded wings. They could go fast for short distances. These guys are basically on the opposite end of the spectrum. They are going to be soaring. They've got really long, broad wings that are fantastic for being able to catch an air current and just ride that thermal for pretty much the whole day. It does mean that they're really clumsy when it comes time to actually land on the ground. If you ever get the opportunity to watch turkey vultures come into land for a meal, it's fairly comedic. They're not at all graceful. They've just got too much wing to really pull it off well. But it does mean that when we're seeing them flying, we hardly ever get to see them actually physically flapping their wings unless they are taking off or trying to land. They don't need that control because they're just gliding through the air. Now, with that, normally I would give you guys a species in particular to take a look at, but you should really just take the opportunity to familiarize yourself with all of these species that we have here in North America. There's only 3 of them. Their ranges do overlap, so it's a good idea to be able to tell them apart. And more particularly, to tell them apart from our other soaring, darkly colored birds that you may encounter. Say, for example, the golden eagle, which is of a fairly similar size to our turkey vulture, at least to a degree that when you see it soaring several hundred feet up in the air, you might not necessarily be able to tell them apart. Now, proportions are always important for this, for defining a family of birds. You've got those really long, broad wings, which is great. The posture of the wings, how they're held, can help you a lot. They tend to be kind of a shallow V, and turkey vultures in particular are super wobbly in the wind. But I actually do want to point out that those bald heads they've got are actually kind of helpful. Not that you can see them very well, but because they look so much smaller than the rest of their body. Feathers take up an amazing amount of area in opposition to their actual mass that they add to a bird, which means that whatever part of a bird's body is not covered in feathers tends to look ridiculously tiny in comparison. So that is Cathartidae. Please take a look at your vultures. They're well worth the opportunity to learn more about and observe, and they're one of those species that it's kind of easy to just dismiss as, oh, that's a turkey vulture, I don't need to pay any attention to them. But they've got a bunch of really cool behaviors that it's worth knowing about, and they're incredibly important to our healthy ecosystems. So have a great day, and I will see you all next week with another family of birds.